Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something really profound. We're looking at how two vivid ancient stories about camels completely decode the balance between human effort and divine reliance in Islamic thought. You know, there's this really common misconception out there that deep faith requires this sort of passive resignation to the universe. We often think that surrendering to a higher power means giving up our own agency, right? But as we explore the primary texts and historical context today, we're going to see that true, profound faith actually demands the exact opposite. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with two camels, two concepts. Then we'll move into joy in the desert, followed by forgiveness and social harmony. After that, we'll cover the concept of tawakkul, then a segment called Tie Your Camel, and we'll wrap it all up with the active faith balance.
All right, part one, two camels, two concepts.
Let's dive right in by dismantling that major misconception I just mentioned. A lot of folks assume that surrendering to God means giving up your personal agency. You know, just sitting back, throwing your hands up in the air, and letting the universe handle things. But Islamic ethics actually present a highly active, incredibly dynamic framework for living. To really grasp this, consider this question. What does a lost camel in the desert have to do with your inner peace? I know, it sounds a bit like an ancient riddle, but it actually anchors some really heavy, abstract theological concepts to a vivid, highly relatable visual. We're going to journey from repairing the past through active forgiveness to facing a totally unknown future through absolute trust.
Which brings us to section 2, joy in the desert. Let's look at our first core concept to really understand the profound nature of divine mercy. But before we get to our first camel, we need to quickly define two critical terms, tawbah and istighfar. In Islamic thought, these aren't just passive feelings of guilt where you sit alone in a dark room, say I'm sorry, and just move on. No, they represent a deeply purposeful physical action. Tawbah literally means to return. It requires honest regret, absolutely, but more importantly, it requires a firm, active resolution to completely change your ways. It's a literal 180-degree turn in behavior. You're walking down one path, you realize it's destructive, and you actively turn around to walk back toward God.
And the sheer scale of God's response to that physical action of turning back, it is absolutely brilliant. It's captured perfectly in a famous hadith narrated by Anas ibn Malik. Just picture this for a second. You are traveling completely alone across a vast, unforgiving desert. You lose your riding camel, and crucially, that camel carries your entire supply of food and water. You search frantically under the scorching sun, but nothing. You are utterly alone. Exhausted, you finally lie down in the thin shade of a tree, completely losing hope. You close your eyes, basically awaiting certain death. And then, suddenly, you wake up. You open your eyes and your camel is standing right there in front of you. Imagine that rush of euphoric, life-saving relief. Well, the Prophet Muhammad stated that Allah is even happier with a person's sincere, active repentance than that desperate man is at finding his lost camel.
But there's this slightly humorous, incredibly human detail included in this text that really drives the point home. When the dying man suddenly wakes up and grabs his camel's reins, he is so overwhelmed with boundless joy that he blurts out, "O Allah, you are my slave and I am your Lord." Obviously, he meant to say the exact opposite, but his brain completely short-circuits from the sheer extreme joy of the moment. It's such a beautiful narrative device. It shows us that the magnitude of divine forgiveness isn't cold or bureaucratic. It's overwhelming, joyful, and deeply life-giving. Moving on to section 3. Forgiveness and social harmony. So, if God's forgiveness for the individual is that vast, how does Islam expect humans to apply this concept to each other? Let's pivot from divine forgiveness to social healing. Just like Tawbah, human forgiveness is an active, ongoing process. Yes, it requires the internal effort of feeling sincere regret, but it certainly doesn't stop there. It then demands the outward effort of actively seeking reconciliation to mend broken relations, and finally, the noble, really difficult act of forgiving those who have wronged you. It's a messy, purposeful effort to weave a community back together after it's been torn apart. But let's be absolutely clear here. Islam doesn't demand toxic positivity where you just let abusers walk all over you. There's a very delicate balance required. While Islamic ethics highly encourage letting go of resentment to restore social harmony, it never demands mercy at the expense of necessary systemic legal justice. For serious harms, the principle of qisas, which is retributive justice, ensures strict legal accountability. A judge always has to balance these. A victim's family consistently has the absolute right to seek legal redress. However, they are highly encouraged as an extraordinary act of spiritual virtue to waive that right and actually choose mercy.
We actually see this unparalleled social power of mercy modeled perfectly in history. For years prior to 630 CE, early Muslims faced severe persecution, economic boycotts, exile, and brutal violence at the hands of the Quraysh tribe. But when the conquest of Mecca took place in 630 CE, the power dynamics shifted entirely. The Prophet Muhammad marched into the city and suddenly held absolute power over his former oppressors. He literally could have exacted terrible, entirely justified revenge. Instead, he made a calculated, profoundly active decision to pardon his former persecutors, declaring, "Go, for you are free." This wasn't a sign of political weakness. It was a masterful action meant to break a generational cycle of vengeance and permanently unite a deeply fractured society.
All right, part 4, the concept of tawakkul. Okay, so that effectively covers repairing the past. But what about facing the unknown future? Let's transition to the second half of our explainer and look at the concept of trust. The core term here is tawakkul. This means placing complete trust and reliance on Allah, acknowledging Him as al-Wakil, the ultimate trustee or disposer of affairs. But pay super close attention to the second half of that definition, while actively making efforts. Tawakkul is profound, unwavering reliance, yes, but it is never passivity.
The crucial point of this active reliance is perfectly captured in the ancient story of Hajar. Left entirely alone in a desolate, sun-baked desert valley with her infant son, Ismail, she possessed absolute, unshaken certainty that God would not abandon her. Her spiritual trust was absolutely flawless. But here's the thing. Her perfect spiritual trust did not stop her from intensely physical striving. She didn't just sit in the sand and await for a magical rainstorm to appear. She actively and frantically ran back and forth between the mountains of Al-Safa and Al-Marwa searching for water. And not just once, but 7 times, pushing her body to the absolute brink of exhaustion. Today, millions of pilgrims commemorate her actions through a ritual called sa'i, which literally translates to strive.
Which leads perfectly into section 5, tie your camel.
And this brings us to our second famous camel analogy. A man once came to the Prophet Muhammad and asked a very logical, straightforward question. He said, "Should I leave my camel untied and simply rely on Allah to protect it?" The Prophet's response was immediate and fundamentally corrective. Tie your camel and put your trust in Allah.
That singular piece of advice completely dismantles the idea of passive resignation. Leaving the camel untied and going to sleep isn't a demonstration of supreme faith, it's just negligence. True tawakkul is a necessary 2-part equation. It means striving as hard as you possibly can with your physical limbs, tying the knot tight, locking your doors, studying for the exam, doing everything practically in your power. Meanwhile, you simultaneously keep your heart completely reliant on God's ultimate decision, fully accepting whatever the final outcome might be.
And finally, section 6. The active faith balance. Let's bring these two immense themes together to see how they synthesize into a complete, balanced worldview. You see, both of these concepts strictly demand action. Forgiveness requires the incredibly messy, difficult action of repenting, reconciling, and overcoming deep-seated grudges. Tawakkul requires the literal physical sweat of striving, running between mountains, and making sure you actually tie your camel. But most importantly, both require the ultimate spiritual action, the heart letting go. You've got to exert maximum effort, and then you must let go of past resentment, just as you let go of future anxiety. Just a quick note before we wrap up, this rich exploration of theology, social dynamics, and historical context comes directly from robust academic source texts, such as the Islamic Academic Research Journal, which explores this exact intersection of divine mercy and interpersonal reconciliation.
Which leaves us with a final thought to reflect on. We've seen how a lost camel in a scorching desert teaches us about the overwhelming, life-giving joy of actively repairing our past. And we've seen how a tied camel teaches us how to practically, physically trust the future without ever succumbing to passivity. So I leave you with this. How are you going to tie your own camel today? How will you put in that concrete, active effort required in your daily life while simultaneously letting go of the anxieties of the outcome? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.